All right, welcome to chapter 10, the endocrine system. So this chapter is the beginning of our next section as we prepare for the third exam. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and switch. Well, actually, let's start here. With question number 1, describe the general characteristics of the endocrine glands and cells. What is a hormone? So this is kind of one of those systems that a lot of people don't know a lot about. If you were to ask somebody on the street, what is the endocrine system? Probably a lot of people wouldn't be able to tell you. So, but it is a very important regulatory system. So the main, I think, regulatory system is the nervous system. It regulates so many different processes in the body. But the endocrine system is extremely important also in coordination and regulating different aspects of the body. And we're going to look at some specific examples of endocrine glands, what they secrete, and how they act on the body. And we won't be able to talk about all of them because it's way too big of a topic, but it'll give you an idea of how the endocrine system works. So then you can look up, specific examples and go beyond what we talk about here. All right, so let's start with some general characteristics. I like to think, what is the endocrine system? So the endocrine system is composed of either cells or glands that secrete hormones into the blood. All right. So now the nervous system, we're neurons that conduct electrical messages long distances and influences activities at, let's say, at a distance. Now this uses chemicals. So instead of going along a pathway along the neuron, this releases chemical messengers called hormones into the blood. And then these hormones travel in the bloodstream to different sites around the body where then they do different activities. All right. So, the regulation of activities is similar in that way, but the mode of action is different, right? All right. Endocrine, endo means within or inside. So endocrine is in internal secretion. And what that means is it's a gland that doesn't have a duct. So let me show you by picture what that means. So an endocrine, well, maybe I'll put this here, chapter 10. Endocrine. All right, so endocrine is internal secretion. And what this means is there's a gland or group of cells. So here's a group of cells. And it's going to secrete its substance into the blood like this. And make some kind of product, a hormone. And that hormone enters the blood and gets transported. But notice there is no like duct. There's nothing that's going to, be a passageway for the hormone. Okay, it's just secreted into the blood. This is in comparison to what we call an exocrine gland. Exo means outside. All right, so an exocrine gland would be, cells. Okay, some gland, but there is a duct that will transport the product, whatever it is. Now it could be like mucus, or it could be, saliva, or it could be, some other secretion, but it'll transport it by way of a duct to a surface. Okay, so here we have our product, and it's going to be transported to a surface by way of a duct. So this is the duct here. And so that's the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine. All right. So a hormone, what is a hormone? Now let's go back. A hormone is a molecule, protein, secreted. So I'm going to put protein here. That is secreted into the blood and influences activities in other cells and tissues. I'm going to draw or bring up a little picture. This is from the textbook. So you guys can have access to that also. Just some of the main endocrine glands in our body, right? The hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal glands, ovaries, testes, pancreas, parathyroids, pineal gland. All right, so we'll talk about some of these again, give some examples, but know that it's just more of again a general understanding of how these types of things work. All right, let's begin here with the hypothalamus. So in the brain. All right. So the hypothalamus, remember, is part of the diencephalon, that kind of center portion of the brain. And we sometimes call it the control center or the master gland, I've heard it called. So, when you look at a brain, the hypothalamus is there's not a lot to it. It doesn't look like much. It's just kind of under the thalamus, more like a region. And hanging off the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. I don't know if you recall, you might need to go back just to look at it. And why is it called the control center? Because it secretes specialized hormones called releasing and inhibiting hormones. And so those are released into the bloodstream. It goes to the pituitary gland, and it will either tell the pituitary gland to secrete its solution or its hormones, or it will inhibit the pituitary gland from secreting its hormones. So it kind of controls the activity of the pituitary gland. And we'll take a peek at the pituitary gland and give you an idea of what's involved in that particular structure. Let's see. I'm going to draw this, but then I'm going to put a nice picture, but it's always good to draw. So let's go ahead and draw the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus kind of together. All right, you might want to give yourself some room. Okay, so the hypothalamus is kind of just this region here, kind of the inferior part of the diencephalon. And then hanging from it is the pituitary gland. Okay, so I'm going to say hypothalamus. All right, and down here we have the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is made up of two parts. There's an anterior part and a posterior part. Now, depending on your textbook, it draws the anterior and posterior in a different way. I'm gonna peek at. Hold on. Okay, so there's a part here called the anterior pituitary. And then back here is the posterior pituitary gland. And we have to distinguish because they each secrete different hormones. All right. So let's begin here. And remember I said that the hypothalamus is the control center. So the hypothalamus is going to secrete its hormones, which will be the releasing and inhibiting hormones. Okay, and now those are going to influence the pituitary gland and tell it to release or not release its hormones. So let's start with the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland secretes a couple hormones. The first one is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to be secreted into the blood and then go on to influence the activity of the uterus. Okay, and it's going to cause contraction of the uterus, and also it's going to act on the mammary glands. Okay. And causing expelling of milk. Oops, here it goes. So oxytocin influences smooth muscle contraction in the uterus and mammary glands. So, and then secretes something called ADH, anti-diuretic hormone. So a diuretic is anything that makes you urinate more, okay, or pee more. So, alcohol is a diuretic, caffeine is a diuretic. There are lots of drugs that are diuretics that cause you to urinate more, pee more. So this hormone is anti-diuretic, meaning it makes you pee less. All right. So this is a conservation hormone. So if you're not drinking enough water, all right, your body needs water. So what it's going to do is secrete this hormone to cause you to retain more water in your body. And so you urinate less. And that's why when you're not drinking a lot of water, you don't pee that much, right? You don't have to go to the bathroom that much. It's because of hormones. So anti-diuretic hormone acts on the kidneys and causes us to retain water. H2O is water. 2 hydrogens and oxygen is water. Oops. All right. I should put here maybe it causes contraction. Okay, so those are the posterior pituitary glands. Let's take a look at the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland has more hormones that are released. And we'll start with the first one, which is, let me go in the same order. All right, prolactin. I'm putting it in an order that's similar as the picture, so you don't get confused. All right, prolactin, think of lactation, which is milk. So it acts on the mammary glands. Okay. Helps with lactation. Next we have, okay, I'm gonna look more closely. Sorry, I gotta look at the picture so I go in order. Hold on. All right, so melanocyte stimulating hormone. All right, so MSH influences, and remember, these are secreted right into the blood, and then it's going to travel to its target tissue, which is the skin. And what it does is there are cells called melanocytes, which produce melanin. So increases melanin, which is the pigment in our skin. So when we are exposed to UV light, we stimulate the melanocytes to make more melanin, which causes our skin to get darker. Right? And this is a protective thing. So the melanin actually surrounds the nuclei of our cells and protects our DNA to, prevent mutations and things like that. So increases melanin, so we get a darker skin. You ever think about that? It's kind of a weird thing. You go out in the sun and then it changes your skin color, right? And it's all through this, through hormones. All right, let's keep going. Gonadotropic hormones. All right, there's several. FSH and LH. So gonadotropic means gonad stimulating, and the gonads being the ovaries or the testes. So FSH and LH stimulate the gonads. The gonads would be the ovaries or testes, depending on what sex you are. Okay. And that's going to cause different things to happen. We'll talk about that in reproductive system, okay, near the end, and we'll talk about their role in, in especially the female menstrual cycle. Okay. Let's see. Next is TSH. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, I'm going to start abbreviating. I'm running out of space. All right, which is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is another endocrine structure because it then, after being stimulated, will in turn release its thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, which influences cell metabolism. Okay, so some people who have trouble, let's say, with their weight, maybe they gain weight, secreting T3 and T4 or not secreting it will influence cell metabolism it will decrease metabolism, which is how our body uses energy. All right. And so some people, and if you've heard of people saying, oh, it's my thyroid gland, well, it's true. All right. Next in line is ACTH. Okay. So now we're going to come over here. ACTH, which stands for adreno. Corticotropic hormone. So it's going to influence the adrenal gland and cause all kinds of things to happen at the adrenal gland. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think we will talk a little bit. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the adrenal gland. And then one more, I'm going to kind of go through this here, GH, okay, which is growth hormone. And this stimulates cell growth, especially in like the bones and the muscles. And so let me pan back. As you see, the endocrine system is very complex. Okay, just like the nervous system is very complex and it influences a lot of activities in the body. I mean, look at cells, cell metabolism, cell growth, your gonads, skin. Okay, so many different structures that are influenced by hormones. All right, so let's go ahead and go to here. And I do have a nice nice image from the textbook. Okay, so this is taking a look at, let me make it a little bigger. We can see the hypothalamus, which is right here in this little area. Okay, here's the thalamus, part of the diencephalon. Here's the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland hangs down here. Okay. Okay, these are all the posterior pituitary gland hormones and the anterior pituitary gland hormones. Okay, I think we covered that. What hormones are released by anterior, posterior? What do they act? What are their actions? Okay, so this is a nice little thing. All right, so let's take a look at some examples. Okay. Let's start with growth hormone here, one of the anterior pituitary gland hormones. Okay, let's see. And what is the action? And as I've mentioned, it influences growth, okay, especially bones and muscles. What happens when there's too much? Okay, you get a condition called gigantism. So if you get too much growth hormone as a child, you know, when your bones haven't fused yet and you're still growing, okay, it will make everything grow. So that's called gigantism. I have a couple of pictures too. If there's too little during childhood, it's called pituitary dwarfism. Now, there's different types of dwarfisms. Okay, so pituitary dwarfism is kind of where the body's in proportion. Okay, everything's in proportion, and everything's just smaller. Okay, there's a different type of dwarfism that is not associated with the pituitary gland, and it's what is it called? Achondroplastic. It's I think connective tissue, cartilage kind of disorder, but the proportions will be different. And just so you know, that's why we say pituitary dwarfism. Here's something, if there's too much growth hormone in adulthood, okay, so what happens when the bones have fused already and can no longer lengthen, all right? What happens is the bones begin to widen, and this is called acromegaly. So maybe I'll put this here. Widening of the bones, okay, instead of lengthening. So let's take a look at some images when you have too many or too much growth hormone and too little growth hormone. I'm going to make this smaller. All right. So this would be obviously, okay, this gentleman is 8 feet. And then this is hyposecretion, which is not enough. Hyper secretion is too much, right? If you're hyperactive, you have too much activity. So hyper means more. So hyper secretion, and then hypo means less. Okay. And that's why the hypothalamus is less than the thalamus or underneath the thalamus. All right, and then this gentleman is 2 feet, 5.37 inches. Wow. So this is pituitary or gigantism and pituitary dwarfism. And the other condition is acromegaly. So what does this look like when someone's bones begin to thicken? Okay, you get it in the face and the hands a lot of times. And yeah, everything's just kind of thicker. All right. All right, let's take another look at, and I've already talked a little bit about ADH. antidiuretic hormone. So first, ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. And it acts on the kidneys to retain water. We will talk a little bit more about this when we get to the urinary system, okay, and exactly how does it work. But ADH is secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, which act on the kidneys, which causes you to retain more water. In other words, you keep more water in your body, which means you pee less. All right. And this is a normal hormone. And again, if you just haven't been drinking a lot of water, then you will secrete this hormone. Okay. And on the other hand, if you drink a lot of water, okay, what happens? You pee more. Why is that? Because you don't secrete the hormone. So without the hormone, the water will just kind of pass through. You'll retain what you need to retain, all right, for living. But because you're drinking a lot more water, it will just kind of pass through you instead of being retained. Okay, let's take a look at the thyroid gland now. So, what types of conditions are associated with the thyroid gland? So let's kind of review really quickly. The thyroid gland, remember, secretes two hormones, T4 and T3. T4 is called thyroxine, T3 is triiodothyronine. So the iodo, the 4 and the 3 refer to iodine. So iodine is a component of these thyroid hormones. All right. So you need iodine in your body to produce these hormones. So if you don't get enough iodine in your body, you won't be able to make these hormones. And that's really important. If you've noticed that salt, when you buy, what is it, Morton salt, it is iodized salt. And that the whole reason is because of these conditions that can result when you don't get enough iodine in your diet. And so people were getting some of these conditions. Let's see. One of them is called a goiter. Okay. So a goiter is when you have lack of iodine. You don't have enough iodine in your diet, right? And it causes an overstimulation of the thyroid gland by TSH, right? So in other words, if you go back to our picture here of this, okay, when you're not able to make T3 and T4 from the thyroid gland, your body responds by telling your brain, hey, we need more T3 and T4. So secrete TSH, your pituitary gland, anterior pituitary gland, secrete TSH, which then will stimulate the thyroid gland to hopefully make more T3 and T4. But if you're not getting enough iodine, okay, you're not getting enough iodine, you can't make T3 and T4. So the result is the thyroid gland keeps being stimulated and stimulated and stimulated, and so it enlarges. So a goiter is just kind of a fat neck because the thyroid gland is here, and so it will kind of enlarge. And there are pictures of people with giant thyroids. So what do? If you take iodine, then you can get rid of the goiter. All right, a couple other problems that people can have with the thyroid gland is, making too much or too little thyroid hormones. So we call them hyper and hypothyroidism. Take a peek. So hyper is too much, right? Too much thyroid hormones would be things like increased metabolism, you lose weight. Bulging eyes is also comes with hyperthyroidism. But, you just think about too many thyroid hormones, your metabolism is faster. And so it's really hard to gain weight. Hypothyroidism is not enough hormones, thyroid hormones. And so the metabolism is slowed down. So that makes it easier to gain weight or harder to lose weight, right? I hope that makes sense. All right, let's take a peek at the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands are endocrine glands that sit on top of the kidneys. So sometimes they're called um, suprarenal glands. Suprarenal glands. All right. Oh, actually, I do have a little picture to go with the thyroid hormones. Oops. Okay, so look at this action here of the thyroid gland. All right, we do have like releasing hormones secreted to the anterior pituitary gland, which secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, which influence the thyroid gland to in turn secrete T3 and T4, which influences metabolism. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the adrenal gland. So maybe I'll give you a picture first. Let me start with a picture. Oops. All right, so when we look at the adrenal gland, so here's our kidney. They're like little hats on top of the kidneys. The adrenal gland is made up of different regions. Okay, there's a middle region and then there's an outer region. The inner region is called the adrenal medulla. Well, let's start with the outer region, maybe. Okay, let's start with the outer region. All right, so adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is the outer region, and it's made up of 3 layers. Layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3. All right. We call them zona, which is a layer, and the most superficial is the glomerulosa. Then we have the fasciculata and the reticularis. These words mean something. Glomerula or glomerulosa means ball of yarn because there's little, when you look at it under the microscope, there's like little balls in there. Fascicula, or fascicles mean sticks, bundle of sticks. And because when you look at it, it has these like stick-like layers in it, or structure in it. And reticular means network. So it has more of like a network or kind of fibers looking. All right, but they all secrete different things. So zona glomerulosa secretes aldosterone, which controls sodium concentration, which will help you to remember. Zona fasciculata secretes cortisol, like hydrocortisone, and it decreases inflammation, regulates glucose. So glucose is the important thing there. It regulates glucose. And then the third layer, zona reticularis, secretes sex hormones that influences sex drive. So in males, it's not as big a deal because they have the testes, which secrete male hormones like testosterone. And so, this little bit that the zona reticularis and the adrenal cortex secretes, it doesn't really influence it too much. But in a female that doesn't have testes, doesn't secrete testosterone, it makes a difference. So it can really influence sex drive in a female. Okay. And then, if some people have tumors, let's say, and in this region, and secrete too many of these sex hormones. So they have like a masculinizing effect on a female, right? They could have facial hair and other characteristics. All right, so that is the adrenal cortex. The second part, the more deeper layer, is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. All right, and this helps with fight or flight response. So, you hear people picking up a car in a stressful situation and someone is in trouble or in pain because they have a car on top of them. All right. They say they get a surge of adrenaline from the adrenal medulla, as well as activating the sympathetic nervous system. So it can be both of those things acting to help you to lift that car. All right. So, I mean, maybe let's go and I'll draw that really quickly. Okay, so the adrenal gland, okay, sits on top of the kidney. Here's the kidney. And so the adrenal gland would sit like this, like a little hat. Okay, so if we take a look at that little hat, there's an inner part. This is the adrenal medulla. And then this outer region is the adrenal cortex. And the adrenal cortex, remember, has 3 layers in it. So, right, there's 3 layers in here like that. The zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Okay, and so I've kind of abbreviated salt, sugar, and sex. So they all start with S, right? Regulates salt, sodium, and other minerals, actually. So it influences aldosterone. Aldosterone is the main hormone. Fasciculata, it secretes cortisol, which influences glucose metabolism. So that's the sugar. And then reticularis is the sex hormones, right? And so it influences sex. All right. So that is the adrenal gland. Let's take it back. All right. Almost done here. Pancreas. Talk a little bit about the pancreas. Now, if you recall, the pancreas is located right behind the stomach. So posterior to the stomach, we'd have to kind of lift up the stomach and look behind. And let's take a look at what it secretes. Secretes insulin and glucagon. These are both the 2 hormones. Okay, so there's beta cells within the pancreas that secrete insulin, and then glucagon is secreted by the alpha cells. All right. How do these hormones maintain blood glucose levels or homeostasis? Oops. Yep. So insulin lowers blood glucose while glucagon raises blood glucose. All right, let's take a look at how that works. So the pancreas is an organ, got a duct. So it is actually both an exocrine and an endocrine structure. It's really an interesting organ. It secretes digestive enzymes into the duodenum, and we'll talk about this when we get into the digestive system. But we're looking at the pancreas as its endocrine function. So it secretes 2 hormones, insulin. All right, I'm going to make it like a little triangle. Okay, and it secretes glucagon. Okay, and they're both going to influence and regulate blood glucose. All right, so let's take a look at how it works. Now, remember, we have to maintain homeostasis with respect to our glucose levels in our blood. Glucose is really important because it is our main fuel that we use to undergo what we call cellular respiration. So each cell, all cells, need to make energy, and it does it using glucose. All right, now it can use other sources, but glucose is the main source. Our brain primarily runs on glucose, so we have to, it's super important that we maintain it, right? Because if we don't get enough glucose, we don't eat for a while, we can get lightheaded and things like that because, again, our brain runs primarily on glucose. So how does this hormone work? Okay. So insulin is secreted into the bloodstream. Like this in response to food. So we eat food, it goes to the digestive system, it's broken down into components, and glucose, let's say here's glucose, is in our blood. Okay, so our blood sugar or glucose levels rise. So if we look at our levels of glucose, and so when we eat, okay, so throughout the day, our glucose goes like this. We eat food and our glucose levels rise. Okay, right? We eat food and it gets broken down into glucose, and here it is. So I shouldn't mark that. This is glucose. Oh, I shouldn't make it green. Okay, because glucagon is green. I'm going to make it, oh, that's blue. I'm going to make it a blue circle. So here's our glucose because we ate food. So here it is rising. All right. Now we're not in homeostasis, right? So this is the problem. So the pancreas in response will secrete insulin. And how does it work? So here's our cells, and our cells have receptors on the surface. Okay. So we secrete insulin, or the pancreas secretes insulin in response to a rise in glucose. So how does this work? The insulin is going to bind to the receptor, and it's going to allow the glucose to enter the cell. And now that glucose can be used to make energy. But what happens to the blood glucose with insulin? It's like opens a door, all right? This allows this to enter. And so as it does that, it's taking the glucose out of the blood and it's bringing the blood glucose down. You see how that works? So that is how insulin works. Let's take a look at how glucagon works. If you haven't eaten for a while, okay, your blood sugar starts going down. Now that is not in homeostasis. So what do? In response, we secrete glucagon. So glucagon, let's make it a square. Okay, so glucagon here is going to go to our liver and cause the liver to release stored glucose. And stored glucose is called glycogen. All right, so this hormone, glucagon, goes to the liver and causes the liver to release stored glucose. So what does that do? Okay, we got to say glucagon, and bring the blood sugar back up to homeostasis. And so throughout the day, we're constantly secreting insulin and glucagon to maintain that homeostasis. All right, it's kind of amazing how that works. All right. Let's go back. And so I hope this makes sense. Okay, now let's take a look at a condition, diabetes mellitus. All right, diabetes mellitus, which, all right, let me get a couple pictures here that goes with question number 8. Okay, so here's a little pancreas. All right. And this is from the textbook, this next one too, showing you the regulation. All right, and you can look at that later. So, diabetes mellitus. So let's go back to our picture. There are different types of diabetes. Okay, type 1 and type 2 diabetes mellitus. And there's also, so we actually shouldn't use the word just diabetes because there's something called diabetes insipidus, and that has nothing to do, it actually has something to do with the ADH. So we want to say diabetes mellitus. All right, well, what happens if for some reason we don't produce insulin? Okay, so let's say we have a condition, a genetic condition, where we don't make insulin. So no insulin, what happens to the glucose? The door does not open. So glucose stays in the blood and you have an elevated blood glucose level, right? Because you don't make insulin. That's called type 1 diabetes mellitus. Okay, type 1 diabetes mellitus. Let me get another. Okay, so it actually translates into sweet urine. Okay, why? Because there's a lot of glucose, excess glucose in the blood, which spills over into the urine. And so there's glucose in the urine. All right, we'll talk about that, how the urinary system works. So diabetes mellitus type 1 is you don't produce insulin. Okay, so does that make sense? If you don't make insulin, then the glucose can't come into the cell, and then it stays in the blood. So you have an elevated blood glucose, and you're not able to make you're not very efficient in making ATP energy. There's a second type of diabetes called type 2. This one is normal insulin levels. Oops. Levels, but the cells are less sensitive to insulin. All right, so what would that look like? Here's a cell. You have plenty of insulin, lots of insulin. And you have your glucose, okay, because you eat your food. But let's say there's few receptors in it. So yeah, you can get some insulin and you get a little bit of glucose that can enter, but not enough. And so what happens? The blood glucose level stays high. Okay. But it has nothing to do with how much insulin you have. It's the cell's ability to be receptive to it. Okay. So how do you deal with each of these types of diabetes mellitus? So if you have the type 1, you just take insulin. All right, you get insulin injections. You regulate your insulin, but you need an outside source of it. right? What about type 2? Okay. You don't give yourself insulin because you have enough insulin, right? How do you make your cells more sensitive? Your cells more sensitive to insulin, right? You control it through diet and exercise. Okay. A lot of times, obesity is linked to type 2 diabetes mellitus. Not always, but sometimes, a lot of times. And so people who are able to control their weight and their diet and things like that, then the cells become more sensitive. And not really sure how that works, that sometimes with obesity that the receptors are like hidden in there, and so as you lose weight and as you have a healthier lifestyle, then the receptors are more open to it. I've heard different things, but anyway, it is more receptive. All right, so most people, probably 80 or more percent of people have the type 2, the diabetes mellitus. And usually type 1, it's detected when you're young. And so early. All right, so what happens if it's untreated? If you don't control your blood glucose, who cares, right? Well, high blood sugar levels can damage like small vessels over time. And since small vessels are like in extremities and things like that, I've heard of people losing their limbs, right? Having to, amputate extremities like legs, feet and legs and things like that. Kidney failure, because there's lots of blood vessels in the kidneys. So damage to those vessels can result in damage into the kidneys. Vision loss, right? Small capillaries, small blood vessels in the eyes around supplying the eye can affect that also. So anywhere where there's small blood vessels, which is everywhere, will be affected. And so diabetes mellitus is something you really want to control. Okay. Let's go back to and just finish our writing in the study guide answers. Okay. So these are the things that I wrote down. Okay. If you want it, oops, if you want it to look nice and neat. Oh, okay. Okay. A, B. All right. Okay. So I hope that's helpful, and finish up your study guide up until this point, and then we'll do chapter 11 next. We'll start the cardiovascular system. All right. Thanks for joining.